Okay, hi, this is Ron with Mobile Fix Automotive again. I'm going to try to give you another helpful video on a shortcut to replacing the thermostat housing on a 4.0 Ford V6. The book on this engine calls for removal of the intake manifold to replace the thermostat housing. They're very common housings to leak. Stand by, let me show you the parts. So the two pieces to this assembly, and obviously you see I like using factory parts. This is Motorcraft unit. This is the upper thermostat assembly. Everything's made of plastic, so plastic and heat don't go well together after time, so they'll break down and they'll leak. So here's the other Motorcraft part, which is the lower thermostat housing assembly. You can try contacting me for the part numbers on these. However, there are different assemblies for different engines. Here's the part number for the one that we're using. This part number right here covers the single coolant temperature sensor install. In other words, on the top of your housing, this is going to sit on the engine like so, and then this is going to sit, which way does this one point on this? There it goes. So your thermostat is going to sit this way. So right here, there's two. You're either going to have two holes or you're going to have one hole. If you have one hole, like the current vehicle that I'm working on, there'll only be one sensor. I will give you one heads up on this. The O-ring for these sensors are extremely difficult to find a replacement for. If your O-ring starts leaking when you're done with the job, the quickest and easiest way for you to fix it is just to buy another sensor, because the sensor comes with the O-ring. If you try to get a universal O-ring and put it in, it'll either be too fat and it won't go down in the hole, or it'll be too skinny and you'll end up leaking coolant. There are some aftermarket ideas that you can do for them, but I'd rather not confuse everybody with that at this point, and just tell you that if this ends up leaking through the sensor, just put another sensor in it. Okay. So to do this job properly, we're going to change the complete thermostat assembly housing. We are also going to be changing the thermostat, the O-ring for the thermostat, which is going to go underneath the housing. You'll see that in a minute. And then there is a lower thermostat gasket, which doesn't look like an O-ring. It actually looks like a hard rubber band. It's wide and thin. That actually goes down here on the bottom where it actually attaches to the engine. Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to do, which is something I've already done, is get a 7mm socket. Take that one off and that one off. There's three of them. I've already removed the bolts and put them in my magnet tray over to the side. Remove your cover. Okay, at this point, we are going to be dealing with electronics. So get yourself a wrench and remove the negative battery cable from your battery. On this truck, it's an 8mm. This is still the factory terminal. One of the things you can do is take, once you get it disconnected, and put a rag between it and the connector. Sometimes the connectors like to flip back up on top and touch when you're not looking, and it'll cause a little bit of a short. Okay, so step 2 on this, we're going to remove this air snorkel. Now the way you do that, I've already popped this one off, is there's a little, on this particular unit, there's a little plastic tang that you push away from you and then turn to your left, and it will allow the vacuum line to just pop right off. Okay, the next step at this point is a 5/16. I'm using a nut driver to remove both the hose clamps on the air snorkel. We're going to get the air snorkel air tube assembly out of the way. And all you got to do is just fold it back. You're not really going to need to remove it all the way. Okay, so at this point right now, there are two 8mm nuts that I'm going to remove because I am going to be removing the throttle body assembly. And then I'm going to remove the 4 screws that hold the throttle body assembly onto the intake manifold. This hidden one down here in the corner is a little trickier. I use an extension for it. Disconnect throttle position sensor by pushing the tang. Boy, this one's a sticky little booger. Get that off of there. Put your throttle body assembly up on top. Okay, now at this point you don't want any debris falling inside this engine. So get yourself a rag. Put a block off right there to do the best you can to keep debris from getting down in there. Okay, so what we're going to end up doing right now is we're going to take the upper radiator hose off of this assembly. 5/16 nut driver on this one. It's not a squeeze clamp anymore because it looks like somebody's already gone in here once before. Our wonderful salespeople at the Ford Engineer plant rarely ever give us a hose clamp anymore. It's almost always a squeeze clamp. Now, I've already drained the coolant low enough onto this engine so that I can take this off and it's not going to leak a bunch. Make sure you have a catch basin underneath the bottom of the vehicle, either a drain pan or whatever you can get your hands on, so that when the coolant comes down it just doesn't go into the ground. And then at this point what we're going to be left with is we need to take this alternator bolt off so that we can get, or you can remove this clamp. Let me see if this one will come off. Okay, that one came off, so we're okay. All right, so there are two hoses connected to this assembly. There's the heater hose, which goes out the left-hand side, and then there is a bypass hose on the bottom. It's recommended that you change both of those hoses. The lower hose on this one has already been changed once before, so I'm going to elect not to change it. But we will need to be able to remove this hose here and this hose down here. And one of the things I need to do right now is separate there is a wire for the mass airflow sensor that is connected to the wire, charge wire for the alternator. And I'm just taking a pair of needle nose pliers and working it out. There we go. So that now I can disconnect the alternator safely, and it looks like the alternator is possibly a 13mm. Yep. So I'm going to disconnect this alternator wire so I can get this wiring harness out of my way. And then I'm just going to take the nut that I pulled off of the alternator positive charge cable and just kind of put it back on a few threads. And then I am going to remove the electrical connector for the signal wires to the computer, which is just pushing in on a tang and it releases. And then I'm just going to take it and I'm going to tuck it over here behind the power steering unit so that it's out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, that type of stuff. Okay, so if you get the upper radiator hose tucked between the air conditioning tubes, if you're lucky enough to have them, then you can take the breather tube for the PCV system and just push it straight up, and then that will give you a little bit more access. But sometimes I'm able to change these without pulling the alternator, and sometimes the alternator has to come off. I always attempt to change it with the alternator on because it will save time. So the first thing I need to do is I need to remove the upper thermostat assembly for guide so that we have extra clearance. My phone's ringing, but I'm not going to answer it at this time because I do not want to stall the video. There's a hidden 8mm bolt. It's not actually an 8mm size bolt, but the size wrench that you're going to use for it is an 8mm. That's what size the 3 are. If they're all original, the 3 bolts that hold the thermostat housing down are 8mm head. That's what size the hex is. And if you go in with a hand wrench and then use 2 fingers and pull it out like that, and I've been doing this a long time, so dexterity wise I can do that. And then just lift the thermostat housing assembly off, and there's the housing assembly itself. Now these thermostat assemblies, they like to crack. You can see where it's leaking right around this seam. It's a kind of a, I guess, glued together piece that Ford designed, and they do have this problem. So now that that's off, now we need to get our wiring for our sensor out of here. And I got the camera right where I need to actually put my arm, so this ought to be fun. So there's a little push button on the back side of this as well. And once you push it in, it should lift right off, and it's not going to, so I'm going to cheat. And since we have to pull this unit out anyway, I'm going to reach down in here with a pair of needle nose pliers and grab the clip that holds the sensor in and pull the clip out. If you lose this clip, life can get a little difficult, but you can work around it if you have the means. Okay, so now that I'm back, sorry about that, but I had a customer come in to pick up a vehicle. That was a little important, and I had to stop the video for it. So now that I've got the top of the thermostat housing off, I'm going to remove the thermostat itself. So if you're just going to do your thermostat and your housing isn't cracked, it's really not a big deal to get down in here and pull it out. You don't have to pull the manifold, but it's easier if you pull your throttle body assembly off. So I'm going to toss that part in my cart over here. And then what actually ends up holding this assembly down is a couple of bolts that are hidden in the back. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pop this sensor out, because that's what we were working on. I'm going to push the button and pull the sensor out. This is the sensor. This is the O-ring in question. And you know, I spent the first couple of times I did this, these O-rings always leaked on me. It's not a bad idea to put a little bit of silicone around it when you put it back in, but you have to let the silicone completely cure before you put coolant in it and put it under pressure, otherwise the silicone will leak again. So on this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to test fit this sensor to see how tight it is in this hole. And if there's resistance, which there is, then that seal is going to be fine. I'm going to put a little bit of non O-ring eating grease on here and then push it back down in, and it'll actually be fine. So now that I've rambled enough on that, now the next step to being able to change this assembly is to get these 3 8mm bolts out. Now these 3 8mm I find it's easier to access them. I know I'm not supposed to talk when I walk away from the camera. It's easier to access them with a wobbly socket than it is to try to do it with a straight socket, especially the one that's underneath the intake manifold, the one that I'm doing right now, which is closest to the thermostat. Pull that bolt out of there, and the bolts actually will come out. Pull that one out of there, and then there's another hidden one back here. If I was to ever design a vehicle, I have a feeling as a mechanic that I would spend time making sure that when stuff breaks down that it would be easily fixable, especially simple things. I mean, a thermostat to me is a normal wear and tear item. It's something that just goes bad if you keep your vehicle for a long time. So don't you think it would make sense if you made it so you can access it? I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it. All right, apologize for that. Another customer came in. So now that I've removed the 3 bolts for the thermostat housing, the one in the back is a little tricky to get out because it doesn't like to come up and remove itself because of this assembly here. So what we need to do right now is we need to get this hose for the heater detached from the assembly. And there is actually a special tool for removing these squeeze clamps, but I find that an angled needle nose actually works a lot better for me. You just get underneath it and lift up, and the clamp above it likes to kind of prevent it from moving, but you're in charge, so don't let it beat you. And then once that's off, just kind of put it up there on top of the bolt that's sticking out of the side of that thing. And then sometimes I'll pull this assembly out with this bolt in here. And then sometimes I'll just, once that hose is out of the way, you can just angle that forward, the thermostat housing forward, and it'll pop right out. Now the only thing left holding this thermostat assembly in right now is the bypass hose. So there's a hose clamp, squeeze, well, it's not a hose clamp, it's a squeeze clamp for the bypass hose down here. You go down in with the straight needle nose and pop that out. had all my tools out, but I always keep forgetting about this. This is the actual tool for the squeeze clamps if you've never seen one. It's basically grabs the squeeze clamp and then you squeeze the handle on it and it compresses the squeeze clamp. Once you get it locked on there, squeeze. And we're going to see if we can get this hose to pry off of here. Now, if you can't get this hose to move and it's being stubborn, the plan B attack is to take your fan belt off, remove your alternator, and this whole assembly will slide right out to the left. Still, once again, without hey, that's why you're not supposed to put wrenches on your vehicle when you're working on them, because they end up in la-la land. So I almost got this hose worked off. Okay, now that it's off, and see, this hose it's brand new. Somebody's already changed it. So at this point, we can pull the old broken assembly out, and you can see where it's just leaking from the crack. I mean, this whole assembly, it's all split, it's all warped up right here. See if I can come in for a closer angle. See where it's cracked right there? Well, it's not cracked, it's separated. It's leaking from here. So it's best just to change this complete assembly. And then down here on the bottom is that, you can call it a D-ring. It looks like a rubber band, but it's actually an O-ring, and it's gonna fit in this groove. So the first thing I'm gonna do right now is go down in here with a rag, and I'm gonna clean out or clean off the shelf that this thing fits on, because it's got a lot of boogers and snot built up on it from all the stuff. And then a couple of the holes have antifreeze in them, which is going to cause the new bolts to hydrolock. So I'm just going to take an air blower and blow the holes out, but I'm protecting the camera from moisture. Okay, so basically all I did was, and you don't have to do that, but it's a good idea to stick something down in there, a Q-tip swab, get as much of the coolant out of the threaded portion of your holes that you can. Okay, now at this point, we are going to take and open up the gasket for the bottom, and we're going to put the gasket in the recess that they provide for us right here. Now it looks more like an O-ring because it's where it's supposed to be. We can take and put it back in here. Now remember, the hard bolt to get to was this one in the back, so we're going to angle it forward and get that bolt in there right now. Actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the hose back on here real quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck this up out of the way just long enough to get this hose back down on here. Squeeze clamp. Squeeze clamps with a pair of needle nose takes a kind of an acquired touch, because a lot of times the clamp will pop off on you and you won't see it. But what I'm going to do right now is, now I've got this is still compressing our original clamp. And it's always an argument on whether or not you should just replace these with a hose clamp. It's a good idea to do that. In this particular case, we're trying to save every nickel, I guess. So we're going to put that down in there like that. We're going to straighten out the hose clamp, and then we're going to release our tool. And if everything goes right when the tool is released, the hose clamp will be where it's supposed to be. And it did not do that, so I'm going to re-squeeze my clamp. Because I didn't get the thermostat housing down in as far as I wanted it to go. There we go. That looks and feels much better. Now we're going to take and shine a flashlight down underneath and make sure that our red gasket did not fall out of its little hole, which it did not. So now we're going to lean this forward, put our third bolt back in there, and then grab our two other bolts and put it back in there. And then we're simply going to snug these down. I could do this with an air tool, but what I'm doing right now is making sure that I don't cross thread the holes, because I am starting them at an angle. So you want to make sure that you're not fighting these at all. You don't want to cross thread those holes and then have to go in there and fix the threads. So if it's not screwing back in really easy, like you can hear, I'm not fighting this at all. That's what you're ideally looking for. And then what you want to do is you want to torque these things down to within specification. I know pretty much where the torque spec is on it, so I'm not going to bore you with all of that. Now I got just a little bit of non-destructive grease that I'm going to put on here, and I'm going to put the sensor back in the hole. And then for the fun part, this is where the competency test comes in. We're going to put this clip back in here. And I'm going to do it with a needle nose pair of pliers really carefully. And then once I pull the needle nose out, I'm just going to tap it in to make sure it's seated all the way. Now that that's done, I'm going to find the electrical connector for it, line it back up, push the electrical connector back on. This sometimes is a competency test in itself also, but mainly because the camera's right where I usually stand. There we go. Push it down until you hear it click. And so now I'm going to double check, make sure my hose clamps are where they're supposed to be on the front bypass, and they are. Basically you can tell when if they're where they're supposed to be because well, on this one I'm using the old hose, so I can just check and make sure that they overlap exactly where they came off of. On a brand new one, you just want to make sure that the hose clamp is forward of the barb, which is a little bit difficult to explain, but You want to make sure the hoses are on as far as you can get them to go. And then the heater hose is the hardest part, but trying to get this thing back down in. Push it back on, and then take your needle nose pliers. Once again, squeeze your little squeezy clamp. Put your squeezy clamp back on. And now all we have left to do is put the thermostat. Don't forget to put the thermostat O-ring in. And the way you're going to do this is thermostat goes in first. Okay, I have to change the battery in the GoPro, so we'll be right back. Okay, so now we're back on. I had to change my camera battery on the GoPro. One of these days I'll invest in a plug socket so I won't have to deal with that. Maybe it'd be nice if they could build a battery that'll go longer than 45 minutes. Put your thermostat down in your hole, and then this right here, what you want to do is you want to put just a little bit of lubricant on it, Vaseline. You want to be careful what kind of grease you use, because some greases can eat rubber. So if you're going to use grease, just make sure you get the right grease. Put the O-ring around the outside of the thermostat, and then you have your thermostat housing, which is you're going to work in here. They sit on top of these metal dowel pins, so you're going to put those down in there. And then there are 3 bolts that hold these metal dowel pins down, or the thermostat housing assembly. And luckily for me, this was one I did not have to pull the alternator off of. Some of them I do. The bolt in the back, I take a pair of needle nose pliers that have an angle, hold the shoulder, and I just sit it down in there, line it up with the hole, drop it in, release it. Then I can put my fingers back in here, 2 fingers with my dexterity, and start screwing it down. I'm going to get a ratcheting wrench, which actually ratchets, and it'll make it quicker for me to tighten this bolt back here in the back. I'll put 1 finger on top of the ratcheting wrench so that it doesn't keep just turning back and forth. And I will cinch it up, but not tight. You can only move it a quarter of a turn at a time because the power steering housing's in the way. And dropping more wrenches down into the front of the radiator grill, that's always fun. Okay, so we're gonna basically I'm tightening these down, but not all the way. There's a torque spec for these. Make sure you look them up in your book and you don't over tighten them, because you will crack the housing and that will cause a problem. The torque on these is really low. It's not a tighten it up and go until you hear something crack torque. Okay. Give it a nice. Okay. And then at this point, we are going to reconnect our alternator that we disconnected. We got to put all this back together in the order it was removed. Push your alternator lead on until you hear it click, and then tug on it. Make sure that it doesn't pull back off easily. If it does, either it didn't click or the little tang broke on it. Get my 13mm ratchet. Tighten my alternator charge positive B cable back up. Put the rubber protective boot back on it. If you don't have the rubber protective boot, I suggest wrapping this with electrical tape. What this here is for is so if something metal touches this area, it doesn't cause a short in the electrical system. I'm going to put the mass airflow sensor wire back through the little hole that I pulled off earlier, and then I'm going to put this one back on the alternator bracket that we pulled off earlier. Now we're going to pull the radiator hose back out of our pinch point on the air conditioning lines. That was a sneaky way to do that. And they had a hose clamp on here, which is always better than a squeeze clamp, so I'm going to continue that tradition for them and leave it on there. And we're going to reattach our upper radiator hose to the thermostat assembly. And once again, with a hose clamp, you can actually over tighten a hose clamp. If you see the hose clamp, the excess ear that comes off of it, if you see that thing start to twist really bad or point in one of the two directions where it's not centered close to the top of the bottom half of itself, which is wrapped around the hose, then you've over tightened it. This one here, you only tighten them down to a nice firm grip, and then what I always do is go back later on and check it again to make sure that it didn't come loose. Hose clamps are pretty simple, you can probably figure that out. So now on our throttle body assembly, you want to make sure that there's no dust or dirt on your gasket or inside the housing. This one needs a throttle body cleaning really bad. So what we're going to do, can't remember if that was, yeah, goes back there. Okay, so the only thing I was doing wrong was I didn't put the hose, the upper radiator hose, behind the oil fill, which is where it started out. These bolts for this throttle body assembly are just self-tapping screws that go into plastic. Be extremely careful that you don't crack your intake manifold. I recommend, if you're a first-time do-it-yourselfer, I recommend putting these in by hand. They will be a little tight. In some cases, but it's better to err on the side of caution so that you don't crack your manifold. It's probably the biggest thing I worry about when I have to do these jobs is these manifolds are plastic, and just like the thermostat housing itself, they're prone to failure. Okay, I'm just gonna run them down to the 0 point where they're snug, and then I'm going to tighten them up with an actual hand wrench because I don't want to over tighten them. Actually, not a hand wrench, a little 1/4 inch ratchet. So make sure that there's a little firm snugness to them. I think these things are torqued to right around 12 foot-pounds. 8 to 12 I think is where they're at. So we got those done. Now the only thing we have left now of any significance is to put the 2 bolts back on for the throttle cable assembly. Once again, I don't tighten anything on plastic down with an air wrench. I get them close and then I tighten them down with my wrench. Now the only thing left we have over here is the electrical on the throttle position sensor, which only goes on one way, but you have to figure out which way it is. Make sure that it goes on and it doesn't come back off. Okay, at this point, guys, this job is done, and hopefully I showed you a shortcut on how to get this thing out of here if you haven't already figured it out before. Once again, my name is Ron, Mobile Fix Automotive, and my next step is to fill the cooling system up, pressurize it, and make sure that that's not leaking, put my air tube back in, put my my protective cover over the throttle linkage assembly, and for those of you that saw that on the video, put the throttle cable back on the right side, because apparently I rotated it 180 degrees before I put it on, and this crisscrossed, the cable crisscrossed over the transmission kickdown cable, or the, what is it? It's not transmission, this is computer controlled. What am I talking about? That is the cruise control assembly. So I will see you on the next video. If you like this, give me a thumbs up. Doesn't do anybody any good to complain. I'm trying to help everybody out as a do-it-yourselfer, and I'm trying to share the 30+ years experience I have to help people out. So if you need any of this stuff done and you don't want to do it yourself, give me a call. I'll be happy to give you a quote on it and get you up and running. Thanks, guys. Have a nice day.